Okay, we are going to wrap up the course this week with Lesson 7, Module 7, Japan Defeated. So if you want to get your slides ready, we'll be at slide number 2. And May the 7th, May the 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day. While the majority of the world was elated at the end of the war in Europe, there was still several thousand U.S. troops that faced the prospect of a large invasion of mainland Japan. After Germany's defeat, military planners recognized that a one-front war could no longer justify the members and materiel required for a two-front war, which is what America had been fighting since 1941. For one thing, the American public demanded a partial demobilization, and secondly, with victory now secure in Europe, many men who saw significant combat and who had sacrificed much in service to their nation saw little motivation to carry on with the same level of commitment as they had done before. Next slide. To remedy this, as early as September 1944, the War Department issued a public plan that directed demobilization by individuals rather than units. And this plan revolved around the awarding of numerical points to each serviceman, which accumulated towards a total cumulative goal. Officially known as the Adjusted Service Rating, individual soldiers all received points for a variety of reasons. For example, length of service, 1 point for every month served. Overseas service, 1 point for every month served overseas. Participation in a battle, 5 points for each campaign. Decorations, 5 points for each decoration. And dependents, 12 points per child up to 3 children. So with this point system, once a total of 85 points was obtained, the serviceman was eligible for immediate discharge back to the States. And obviously those with the highest points were rotated back home first. And as you can imagine, this point system stripped most Army units of their most seasoned and experienced veterans, and the occupation force was made up largely of inexperienced soldiers. While the point system was marginally effective in the Army, the Navy and Marine Corps refused to embark on demobilization because Japan still posed a threat. Next slide. As early as November 1944, the military staff at the Pentagon began working on what was codenamed Operation Downfall, the final assault on the programmed invasion of Japan. Next slide. In April of 1945, the Joint Chiefs considered the options for bringing about Japan's final surrender, and in mid-May, General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz reached an agreement regarding Operation Downfall. And the operation was subdivided into 2 operations: Operation Olympic, which would entail an amphibious invasion on the southern island of Kyushu, while Operation Coronet would entail the main island of Honshu. While U.S. Army personnel being demobilized, the prospect of having to invade hostile Japan proved very daunting indeed. Next slide. However, prior to Operation Downfall, Army Air Force General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of all U.S. Army Air Forces in World War II, you want to click there, look at the slide, drew a line on a map from the Marianas Islands to Japan that ran straight through the tiny little island of Iwo Jima. Arnold's B-29 bombers badly needed Iwo Jima for an airfield, since it was only 660 miles from mainland Japan. So this invasion of Iwo Jima became known as Operation Detachment, the Battle of Iwo Jima. And it became the costliest battle in Marine Corps history. In fact, over 6,000 Marines died on Iwo Jima, roughly 1 Marine for every 3 who landed. Next slide. Nevertheless, the strategic significance of Iwo Jima was so vital that Major General Curtis LeMay, commander of all strategic air operations against the Japanese home islands, told Admiral Spruance that, quote, "Without Iwo Jima, I cannot bomb Japan effectively." Next slide. Iwo Jima, a tiny little pork chop-shaped island, is comprised mostly of volcanic rock and sand. It was the only island between the Marianas and Japan where an airfield could be built to handle the new B-29 Superfortress bomber. Next slide. Unfortunately, for the U.S. Marines, the Japanese also recognized this strategic impact of Iwo Jima, and in May of 1944, Hideki Tojo appointed General Tadamichi Kuribayashi over the overall defense of Iwo. At 53 years of age, Kuribayashi had served all over the world, to include Deputy Military Attaché in Washington and Military Attaché in Canada. And while in America, he acquired the same impression as Admiral Yamamoto had, and he told his wife, quote, "The United States is the last country in the world that Japan should fight. Its industrial potential is huge and fabulous, and the people are energetic and versatile. One must never underestimate the American fighting ability," end quote. By the end of July, Kuribayashi had ordered all civilians home to mainland Japan and embarked upon a program of tunnel and cave development. And to fend off the oncoming Marines, he would have 21,000 soldiers at his disposal. Next slide. On February the 16th, 1945, American B-24 bombers began bombing Iwo Jima. 3 days later, on the 19th, U.S. Marines from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, more Marines than any previous assault before or since, approached the beaches at 0830 hours in the morning. Similar to the landings on D-Day, the landing beach was divided into sectors. There were 7 of them on the southern portion of the island. From green to blue, approximately 8 battalions of Marines, about 80,000 men, hit the beach. Unlike earlier amphibious assaults on Guadalcanal and Tarawa, the Americans would not enjoy either strategic or tactical surprise at Iwo Jima. Next slide. As they hit the beaches, most sank into the muddy, mushy, soft volcanic rock, sand, and as they struggled to even walk, well-hidden Japanese guns began firing on the Marines. One veteran of the battle stated, quote, "The sand was so soft, it was like trying to run in loose coffee grounds." And as the day progressed, Marines discovered that they literally had to hunt down Japanese troops using hand grenades and flamethrowers. Next slide. By the end of the first day, nearly 600 Marines lay dead, and by the end of the second day, 3,500 more Marines had become casualties. Time magazine correspondent Robert Sherrod reported that the dead at Iwo Jima, both Japanese and American, had one thing in common. He said, quote, "They all died with the greatest possible violence. Nowhere in the Pacific had I seen such badly mangled bodies. Many were cut squarely in half," end quote. Next slide. During these 2 days of horror, Navajo Indian code talkers played a vital role in bringing some order from all the chaos. And working around the clock, they sent and received more than 800 coded messages without error, and none of them were interpreted by the Japanese. And the reason for that, the reason that the Navajo code talkers were so successful was because the Japanese could not decrypt the Navajo language. Next slide. By February the 23rd, the cave system inside of Mount Suribachi on the southwestern tip of the island was in Marine hands. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson, a battalion commander, ordered his executive officer to scale the summit of Suribachi and to raise a 54 by 28 inch American flag for all to see. The lieutenant led his 40-man patrol up the summit and at 10:20 raised the flag. A few men of the 28th Regiment managed to reach the top, where they found a piece of pipe. The 6 men who raised the first flag were Lieutenant Harold Shire, Sergeant Ernest Thomas, Sergeant Henry Hansen, Corporal Charles Lindbergh, PFC Louis Charlo, and PFC James Michaels. 3 hours later, a second, larger flag was raised, and it has since become the iconic image that we are all familiar with. Next slide. When combat photographer Joe Rosenthal arrived at the top of Suribachi, a Marine told him that the first flag was being replaced with a bigger one. Rosenthal asked if they would mind if he took a picture. From about 20 feet away, Rosenthal clicked his camera at the second flag raising. He didn't know it at the time, but he had just taken the most famous photograph of the Second World War and earned himself a Pulitzer Prize. When President Roosevelt first saw the photograph back in the States, he was so moved that he immediately ordered all 6 Marines who had raised the flag back to America. And by the time they could be identified. 3 had already been killed and another badly wounded. Next slide. There are 6 flag raisers who took part in this second flag raising, and which has since become the image or the impetus for the memorial in Washington, D.C., and 4 in the front and 2 in the back. And so we're going to identify those. The 4 front flag raisers are, from left to right, Ira Hayes, Franklin Sousley, John Bradley, and Harlan Block. Next slide. Now, in the reverse of this image, the back 2 are Michael Strank behind Sousley and Rene Gagnon behind Bradley. Strank, Block, and Sousley would all die shortly after they raised this second flag. Bradley, Hayes, and Gagnon became national heroes within weeks, going on tour around the United States selling war bonds. The advance by the Marines on Iwo Jima continued to be a kill or be killed battle. Taking prisoners was out of the question, and the heavy U.S. casualties caused some newspapers to advocate even the use of poison gas. In fact, in early 1944, the Joint Chiefs of Staff began investigating such use, but President Roosevelt rejected this idea, and it never surfaced again during the war. Next slide. In spite of intense loss, on March the 10th, some units from the 3rd Marine Division reached the sea at the top of the island. Admiral Nimitz declared the battle officially over. And for the next several days, the Marines continued mopping up scattered pockets of resistance, and on March the 29th, Kurabayashi had committed suicide. After the battle, a message was found in a cave where 4 Japanese soldiers lie dead. It read, quote, "To the Americans, we have fortified this island for over a year, but we cannot win this war alone with just the warrior spirit. We cannot match your superiority. There is no other road for us to follow but to die." And this is a picture of what Mount Suribachi looks like today. Next slide. During the planning stages for Iwo Jima, Admiral Spruance recommended Iwo Jima be seized first as an air base to support fleet operations against the island of Okinawa. Part of the Ryukyu island chain, Okinawa was also close to mainland Japan at about 970 miles away, and would serve perfectly as a staging point, much the way southern England served for Operation Overlord. Spruance also figured that if Okinawa were captured, it could serve as an air base to interdict Japanese shipping in the East China Sea. Spruance also maintained that the war couldn't be won without having to invade the Japanese mainland. Next slide. Set for April the 1st, 1945, an armada of 1,300 ships carrying 182,000 troops were involved in what became known as Operation Iceberg, which would be the last battle of World War II. Additionally, more Army units were used on Okinawa than Marines. 4 U.S. Army and 3 Marine divisions comprised the strike force. And unlike Iwo Jima, Peleliu, Saipan, and Tarawa, the Battle of Okinawa took place in a much heavily civilian-populated area, and nearly 100,000 Japanese civilians died. Interestingly, both commanding generals also died during the battle. General Simon Buckner was killed by artillery fire, and General Yoshima Matsuro committed suicide. Sadly, a famous war correspondent by the name of Ernie Pyle was also killed during the battle when a sniper's bullet struck him in the head. While Marine and Army forces raced across the island, Japanese kamikazes attacked American ships out at sea. By June the 21st, Major General Roy Geiger declared victory at Okinawa. After the fall of Okinawa, Japan was clearly a defeated nation, but bringing about her surrender became a difficult prospect for a people who simply would not or could not lose face. Next slide. On June 17th, just days before Okinawa fell, President Harry Truman wrote in his diary, quote, "I have to decide Japanese strategy. Shall we invade Japan or shall we bomb and blockade?" Truman was deeply concerned about the potential for staggering American losses should there be a land invasion of mainland Japan. Iwo Jima and Okinawa had been a foretaste for what the struggle for the mainland would have been like. Former President Herbert Hoover urged Truman to abandon any idea for an amphibious invasion because it would cost between 500,000 and 1 million American lives. Was there another solution? Next slide. In the early 1930s and 1940s, fundamental discoveries regarding atomic physics allowed for the possibility of an induced nuclear chain reaction. The groundbreaking work of Danish physicist Niels Bohr laid the foundation for the theoretical exploration of fission, the process whereby the central part of an atom, called the nucleus, absorbs a neutron and then breaks into two equal fragments. In certain elements, the fragments release other neutrons, which quickly break up more atoms, causing a chain reaction that gives off immense amounts of heat and radiation. Next slide. Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard conceived the idea of the nuclear chain reaction in 1933 and immediately became concerned that, if practical, nuclear energy could be used to make weapons of war. Szilard, who fled Nazi persecution, voiced his concerns to his friend and contemporary, next slide, noted physicist Albert Einstein. In 1939, the two men drafted a letter warning President Roosevelt of the plausibility of nuclear weapons and of German experimentation with uranium and fission. After the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt ordered a top-secret United States project to investigate the potential development of atomic weapons. Incidentally, both the Germans and the Japanese were hard at work developing atomic weapons, so it wasn't just the United States. We just happened to be the nation that figured it out first. The Army Corps of Engineers took over and in 1942 consolidated various atomic research projects into an internationally misnamed Manhattan Engineering District, now commonly known as the Manhattan Project, which was placed under the command of Army Brigadier General Leslie Groves. Next slide. Groves recruited American physicist Robert Oppenheimer to be the scientific director for the Manhattan Project at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico. And, next slide, on June the 16th, 1945, the world's first atomic detonation occurred at the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, and this was called the Trinity Test. No one in Allied planning sessions doubted that the Japanese intended to fight to the very last citizen. However, not everyone in Washington believed that dropping the bomb was necessary. Under Secretary of State Joseph Grew, a personal friend of Roosevelt's and a man who had served as the U.S. ambassador to Japan before Pearl Harbor, understood Japanese politics perhaps better than any other American, and he was convinced that not all the Japanese leaders were refusing to talk surrender. In fact, he sensed a legitimate interest from Japan's new premier, Kentaro Suzuki, in actually ending the war. Grew also believed that a single gesture from Washington, a promise to let the emperor keep his throne and title, might give Japan's peace advocates the momentum needed to prevail. Next slide. In mid-July 1945, Allies met at the Potsdam Conference to outline the further prosecution of the war against Japan. When pressed by Grew to concede the emperor's desire to remain in power, Truman stalled until the outcome of the Potsdam Conference. On July the 26th, 1945, the United States, Great Britain, and China publicly released what became known as the Potsdam Declaration to give Japan an opportunity to end the war without further bloodshed. The Soviet Union was still officially neutral regarding this issue and thus declined to sign off on the declaration. Next slide. On the same day, the USS Indianapolis delivered the U-235 portion of the atomic bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, on the island of Tinian. 3 days later, a Japanese submarine torpedoed and sank the Indianapolis. Approximately 900 men went into the water, survived the sinking, but lingered about makeshift rafts or just their life jackets in shark-infested waters for 4 days before being rescued. Of the 900 men who went into the water, only 317 survived. It was the worst naval disaster in U.S. history. Captain Charles B. McVeigh III, who had commanded the Indianapolis since November 44, survived the sinking and was among those rescued days later. In November of 45, he was court-martialed and convicted of hazarding his ship by refusing to zigzag. McVeigh was the only captain ever to be court-martialed for the sinking of his ship. Several things about the court-martial were controversial. There was evidence that the Navy itself had placed the ship in harm's way, in that McVeigh's orders were to zigzag at his discretion, weather permitting. Further, the commander of the Japanese submarine I-58 testified later that zigzagging would have made no difference at all. Admiral Nimitz remitted McVeigh's sentence and restored him back to active duty. McVeigh retired in 1949 as a rear admiral. And while many of the Indianapolis survivors said McVeigh was not to blame for the sinking, the families of some of the men who died thought otherwise, and sent him very threatening letters and so forth. And the guilt that was placed on McVeigh's shoulders finally became too much, and in 1968 he committed suicide. It was almost as if the sinking of the Indianapolis was an omen for the Japanese reaction to the Potsdam Declaration, because there was no indication that Japan intended to surrender. Next slide. A B-29 superfortress by the name of Enola Gay, piloted by Columbus, Ohio native Colonel Paul Tibbets, dropped the first atomic bomb, Little Boy, on the city of Hiroshima on August the 6th, 1945 at 7:15 in the morning. And the world held its breath for a Japanese response. Between 70 and 100,000 people died instantly. But the Japanese remained resolved. Next slide. 3 days later, August the 9th, 1945, the second atomic bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, was dropped on the city of Nagasaki by Major Charles Sweeney, killing around 40,000 people. A third bomb was scheduled to be dropped on Tokyo on August 19, but Truman held off. In less than 24 hours after the bombing of Nagasaki, Japanese Emperor Hirohito agreed to the conditions of the Potsdam Declaration with the caveat that he, the emperor, would remain sovereign. Next slide. On September the 2nd, 1945, General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz presided over the formal Japanese surrender ceremony on board the USS Missouri, which was moored in Tokyo Bay. Next couple slides. After 6 years and nearly 85 million people dead, World War II finally came to an end. VJ Day, Victory in Japan, celebrations erupted all over the United States, particularly in New York's Times Square, where one of the most iconic photographs of a sailor named Glenn McDuffie kissing a nurse, Edith Shane, was taken. Images from VJ Day celebrations around the United States and the world reflected the overwhelming sense of relief and exhilaration felt by citizens of allied nations at the end of a long and bloody conflict. Next slide. Since the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs on Japan, a group known as the Hiroshima Cult has since been active in trying to show that Truman was a warmonger and that he wanted to drop the bombs for various reasons. And one of the great conflicts of World War II was the decision on using the atomic bomb. In the 1960s, a group of revisionist historians began writing books that vilified America's decision to use the bomb on Japan. Among the most prominent revisionist historian is a man by the name of Gar Alperovitz. And in his book, Atomic Diplomacy, Hiroshima and Potsdam, Alperovitz argued that Japan was already beaten by the early summer of 1945, and therefore Truman's decision to use the bombs was more to leverage atomic diplomacy rather than preventing the loss of thousands of American lives in a ground invasion. Next slide. In his book, Racing the Enemy, Stalin, Truman, and the Surrender of Japan, Tsuyoshi Hasegawa argues that once Truman became president, the Soviet Union began a race to get in on the last stages of the war, ensuring their claims to trophies promised at Yalta, at the Yalta Conference, while the U.S. commenced its own race to achieve Japanese surrender before the Russians could declare war on Japan. Now, next slide. So, why revisionism? Well, there are a few reasons for the changing historical interpretations regarding Truman's use of the bomb. Ideology, historical fallacy, and a misrepresentation of facts. Regarding historical fallacy, it's inappropriate to judge and condemn President Truman's decision using today's moral standards. Historians might disagree with Truman's decision, but they have to be prepared to explore the circumstances surrounding that decision in a manner consistent with what Truman actually understood at the time. Forcing postmodern standards of morality back on World War II policymakers is anachronistic, and it's called presentism. Presentism is the anachronistic introduction of present-day ideas, present-day morals, or present-day perspectives into depictions or interpretations of the past. Historians should strive to avoid this at all costs because it constitutes a form of cultural bias and can create a distorted understanding of the subject matter. Truman, like Roosevelt before him, viewed the bomb through a utilitarian paradigm. World War II was a total war, and Truman never questioned the assumption that the bomb should and would be used on the enemy. For Truman, the atomic bomb was simply another weapon in the American arsenal, and neither Truman or anyone else had any idea at that time of the destructive nature or the lingering effects of the atomic bomb. Had the U.S. not deployed the bomb first, there existed a small chance that Japan would have. Japan had a project similar to the Manhattan Project that had been going on. Next slide. Historians like Alperovitz and Hasegawa, they like to point to the 1946 United States Strategic Bombing Survey summary report as if it were the holy grail of statistical data to support their argument that conventional incendiary bombing had essentially already defeated Japan, therefore rendering the use of 2 atomic bombs superfluous. However, a thorough reading of this survey reveals a frustrating deadlock within the Japanese War Ministry over the issue of surrender, which actually extended past the Soviet entry into the war and the second atomic bomb. Contrary to what most revisionist historians would be willing to admit, without the atomic bombs and Russia's entry into the war on August the 9th, Japan would most certainly have continued aggression beyond November the 1st, 1945, the scheduled date for Operation Downfall. For whatever reasons, the survey authors chose not to include post-war interrogations from key Japanese leaders that would have supported this. Those in favor of using the bomb point to the death toll at the hands of the Japanese from 1931 to 45. And when you look at that death toll, over 17 million people died because of the Japanese. A little more than 100,000 died in both atomic bombs. All right, we are going to conclude Lesson 7, and we've got a few minutes to go over the note sheet. So let's go ahead and do that. All right. As soon as I find them. Okay, so Lesson 7, Japan defeated. Number 1, the adjusted service rating allowed soldiers to separate from the Army based on a point system. 2, America, Great Britain, and China signed and issued the Potsdam Declaration. 3, the invasion of mainland Japan was codenamed Operation Downfall. 4, Operation Coronet involved an invasion of the island of Honshu. General Henry Hap Arnold was commander of all U.S. Army Air Forces. Number 6, the code name for the invasion of Iwo Jima was Operation Detachment. Number 7, Japanese General Tadamichi Kobayashi oversaw the defense of Iwo Jima. Number 8, a total of 3 Marine divisions landed on Iwo Jima. Number 9, Navajo code talkers proved essential to victory. Number 10, 6 Marines raised the American flag at Mount Suribachi. 11, correspondent Joe Rosenthal captured the iconic flag-raising photo. Number 12, John Doc Bradley was the only flag raiser who was not a U.S. Marine. He was a Navy corpsman. 13, Harlan Block, Michael Strank, and Franklin Sousley were all killed on Iwo Jima right after the flag raising. Number 14, Okinawa is part of the Ryukyu island chain. Number 15, Operation Iceberg was the code name for the invasion of Okinawa. Number 16, Danish physicist Niels Bohr laid the foundation for fission. Number 17, the Manhattan Project. Number 18, New Mexico. 19, Potsdam. 20, Little Boy. 21, Paul Tibbets and Enola Gay. Number 22, MacArthur. Number 23, the Big Six. Number 24, B-29. Number 25, civilians. That's going to wrap up the note sheet. I want to thank you all for your confidence in myself and for taking this course in World War II.